really? And I got to call the in, and sure enough, I still couldn't figure out what the deal was, how they combine, you don't bundle up energy like you bundle up mortgages, because of course you can't sit them on a shelf. You got to deal with it. But that was basically the idea, that you could give people the best possible deal all the time, right up until you couldn't. And then boom, the thing went down. Yeah. And I thought, oh Lord, have mercy. And but then, and then wham, here comes a cold front on top of all that, which just compounded the problem. And then we watched all that horrible thing go on. But it was another case of the far right, whatever it takes to make all the money we can. Boys at work, they just can't stop, we've got to make money. And so they were busy saying, oh, everything's going to be fine, of course. And you see where it is now. They finally got some of the power back and heat working. And I'm just glad I'm not there.
Right. As you were hearing this, where was your source for data? Where was it? Television? Was it internet?
I was watching. Well, at first I caught like a headline news thing. I went either MSNBC or First News, and then I was sitting on my computer looking through that. And there's a couple of free sites there that I look at pretty regularly, just to see, what is everybody else saying? Who's talking about this? Is there only just one person or one side, or is it like a whole bunch? And when you get on there and it's like, same story keeps popping up, it's a big story. You just pay attention to it and decide whose slant you want to take on it. Most people, as you say, most people didn't know that Texas had their own power system.
Right.
That was the kicker right there. They've been stinking proud about that for years, and well, not that many years, but a long time. And the fact of how it went down, was not really obviously right there all the time. People didn't. Otherwise, they would have stopped and they would have done something to it. But this is, the right wing that took over Texas with Greg Abbott and the boys was a relatively new crew. And so that's been, I didn't know too much. I knew who Abbott was, but I didn't really know what all
was it a case of, oh, we don't have to worry about extreme weather?
That's right.
Let's not put that in the bill.
Okay. Time,
Yeah. Not even God can sink this ship, right?
That's right. Anyway, so yeah, we you don't want to be, it's hard to be gleeful about them getting their hoist on their own petard, kind of move, because it really affects the ordinary citizens far worse than it does anybody with a lot of money tied up in it. Of course, the poor folks with a lot of money tied up in it would be wailing and crying about it now, but the folks who don't have any power, that's another matter altogether.
Yeah.
I'm of the opinion, firstly, that they're going to decide that maybe it would be a good idea to have some oversight that didn't involve a politician making money on it. Mm-hmm. If they can't figure that one out, they're doomed to repeat this scene, Act 3, Act 4. And, I never saw it said that the political guys in Texas were the brightest bulbs in the box. So apt.
I have some more on that, but Dustin, why don't you follow up there?
Mine was interesting. There's not a lot of news about this. There is a bit on the radical left side. They're more interested in making fun of Ted Cruz at this moment. And they just kind of, this Texas power outage is like, well, what did you expect? There are Republicans in Texas. And I'm like, okay, well, that's a bit small-minded. So they really dive a lot into this. So I had to search for things, basically. I think one of the people I listen to regularly mentioned it, but I had to search for it. And, I find stuff on Al Jazeera and Intercept and things. I'm finding it's really fun to go look at international news, cover American news.
Mm-hmm.
So,
so it's just fascinating. So, but a lot of the stuff was really just, well, you remember Enron, and then that's the end of the discussion. And because you kind of have to go back and look at the last 40 years of politics in Texas And then when on the left side, they immediately get distracted by the changing demographics, which is going to change the electoral equation in Texas. But they don't go back to, okay, well, we've got a great case of, deregulation is, I guess, fine in theory, but in practice we do. So are we forcing our representatives to remember to put in the emergency weather plan in their energy bills?
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder how much, there seems to be a lot of cynicism behind this. And in previous discussions, we talked about creating the narrative and,
Mm.
who it is who determines the narrative. What I see happening is something occurs. I mean, this incident, the recent bombing in Syria would be another one, where something occurs and there's not an immediate response. It's as though, okay, we're going through these stages of, first of all, denial, no, it didn't happen, and then we're on our way through the steps until we've reconciled it. And the reconciliation seems to be, how can I make this fact fit into and support the narrative I already have? How do I go about juggling this around so that I can fit it into my narrative? Well, the Republicans leaped to one that was really stupid when they said, well, you see, the Green New Deal doesn't work and solar power is unreliable. And they went to that they thought they really had something. See, we told you it would happen like this. And then they found out, well, that's really not true. These were gas and coal things that were responsible for this. The solar and wind had very little effect on it. So now they had to go back and fix it again. And I wonder just exactly how deliberate that is and how much of it is just knee-jerk reaction. In other words, do they get together? We always remember these scenes of, like, from I don't know, from all the President's Men. All the guys are gathered in the newsroom and they're talking over how are we going to present this story? What are we going to lead with? And are they still doing that, or do they just put Sean Hannity on the air and say wherever you want with no research? I don't.
It's a little bit of
that. Well, I don't know how it goes. I'd like to see more of the process, and I think that's what we've been talking here about for the last several months, actually. But what is the process? How can you make the process of news gathering and reporting and reconciliation with your bias? How do you make that transparent so everyone can understand where you're coming from?
No, I would jump in of the a good relatable example is just your local network news. First, we should all know now they get a script. It used to be, here's some things that and you get to pick your whatever. It was like, no, here's your script from Garrett Publishing or whoever owns everything. And you flip around, local news is at 6s and they're all the same words. Yeah. So there's that. Like, you could have, I would love to have community councils, volunteers for the news kind of thing.
Yeah.
As let's do some research kind of stuff. Let's do some pre-polling. Let's do, don't just read the script of that owner.
Yeah.
But to your, sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's right. That's what they do, isn't it? That's what money will buy you, the right to just decide how the news is presented, at least up to a certain point, until it's not, and then you have something else. One of these people gets out on the road and then something's happening, they start talking. They don't have any choice in them. What they're gonna, they don't think about spinning it. They're just talking about, here's, so and so's, look, this car's been run over and somebody's been in it and so on. Mm-hmm. So yeah, but yes, they all got scripts and they got a bias built in.
And what I've heard from people who've left corporate media, especially, is it's not said, but it's known. That's the other part. Like, they do get the memos of read this in your story or you don't get a television station anymore. That actually happens. But there's also well, I know if I start talking about unions, I'm gonna be dragged into a meeting. I know if I do this, or I won't get dragged into a meeting. I just mysteriously won't get my bonus this year. There's more of it. But the idea of, like, is it a knee-jerk reaction? Getting back to that, one thing I've been trying to do, and I found the right words, but it's maybe if we stop thinking of these people as politicians and start thinking of them as celebrities, like what would a celebrity do in this situation? Not necessarily the right thing for the people. What's right for them? What's the biggest, like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, to the point we were making last week, I think the celebrity's concern is, are you watching me?
Yeah.
Or if you're not watching me, I don't exist. So you got pay attention, love me, pay attention to me over here. And I think there's a lot of that going on especially with the majors on, NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, and so forth. It's pushing a celebrity. They change the anchor because people don't like to look at them. They're not pretty enough.
I'm only 25. What's going on?
Right. So I guess the thing that I'm looking for, I mentioned that, my habits, I guess I'm trying to understand my habits. And then by extension, I'd like to know what your habits are. And I want to be able to ask this question of other people. I tend to get a universal agreement among my acquaintances because my friends are normally on the left. I have some people who are friends and family on the right, but most of the people that I associate with tend to be on the left. I mean, it just sort of flows naturally. So how are they actually getting their information? And I think, and I was struck by something Andrew said last week, that the three of us probably have a much broader scope of information than the average individual. Many people might listen to as little as 15 minutes of news in a day, maybe less. So what they're relying on is their bias. So the news item comes up, and I've experienced this with people, with relatives particularly. You mention something and they have an immediate response. They don't need to have more information. You tell them, the power went out in Texas. Well, the Green New Deal. It's an immediate leap based entirely on their bias.
Yeah, that was the well, it's kind of interesting because like my initial bias would be, and I think, and I'm gonna make fun of it. This might be for a lot of people. Congress is ineffective. Corporations are greedy. Texans are self-interested. And while that still may be true, after I've researched this story, what do I do with that? Like, I guess that fourth part is, that bias will serve me in this discussion. Everything I found out, I could prove my initial bias. Like nothing really came into conflict there. But it's the, well, what do I do now thing, or how do I get this not to affect me? Like that fourth question.
Yeah. Who do I have in Texas?
Yeah.
In the way of family,
Yeah. So this was I felt this at 9/11. I'm going to get kicked off the air for saying this. I'm like, at the time, I don't think I knew anybody in New York. And I was just as upset as everybody else, but everybody seemed a little more upset. I'm like, you don't know anybody in New York either. And it was just like, I get it, but I don't get it. And I guess it's just this, how emotional do you want to get? I'm going to back off that 9/11 comment because that was silly. But back to Texas, the new question that came into my mind, and Paul, you had mentioned this, was I did find out that they're on their own energy grid, which is relatively unique. There are major energy grids that operate over regions, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And Texas is its own confined region.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure it was deliberately done that way over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, my new question is, what is the benefit of having, like, each state have their own grid, or a national grid, or a, what do we have? We're whatever America is, a federation of grids.
Yeah.
Which
three of
the pros and cons of each of those, Paul?
Yeah, there are three of them, basically, the East Coast, West Coast, and Texas.
Well, also Alaska and Hawaii have been.
Alaska and Hawaii, but they do. Well, I'm not sure who runs that. If they run their own, or
Yeah.
I can't imagine they do, because you have a refinery running there, which is not the best place. For there, the best thing to do is figure out how to get stuff out of here, get the oil out of this part of the country, take it someplace, which is why they have the pipelines, right? The big pipe there, because we all know that gets plugged up, and nobody gets any juice. Hey, keep it flowing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are those various groups, and I have no idea what they do in Mexico or in the south.
I would imagine that on the plus side, like if Kentucky had its own power grid, you wouldn't have to maybe say Kentucky was really liberal, that you wouldn't have to wait on the rest of the country to do what you want. Like you can go ahead and introduce solar power, and you wouldn't have to wait for Texas to approve.
Well, remember, this is not government. This is private business doing this. While there is some government regulation, the real reason behind the power grid is that electricity is an instantaneous power source. You can store it to a certain extent, but our electricity is not stored. What's powering my computer right now was produced a fraction of a second ago.
Gotcha.
So in order to make the economics of it work, the power grid allows shifting of power from one place to another. So if Kentucky's producing more power than it needs right now, we're shipping some of it to Illinois. And so that's what the power grid actually does, but it's more for economic reasons than for security reasons.
Okay.
And this gets back to a bigger issue. Paul, I think we've talked about this before. There's two ways of looking about how you organize any kind of enterprise. It's either a top-down or it's a modular approach. So in this case, it's pretty top-down. We've agreed that we're going to have centralized power plants, and if you're running one of these power plants, you can't turn it on and turn it off real quickly. So if you're producing more power and the weather changes and people don't use it, you got to do something with it. So it goes out on the grid.
Right, and you don't get as much money.
Right.
That's the key. Oops, we don't get as much money. Well, it's funny because as I was growing up many long years ago, I do recall what was happening in the power supply in this little town. They had their own little power plant there, and and in the evening, I'd just throttle down, and so everything kind of power would get real weak, and then they come in the morning, they'd fire it back up, and everybody's like, "Oh, we really hate this, we should have this power all the time." And of course, then Texas Power and all that came in and said, "Hey, connect up with us, and you'll have power all the time. Sell out. You won't have to worry about keeping the power plant up. You won't have to do anything. Just turn on the switch."
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, great, let's do that.
Sounds like some bad bosses I've had.
So why don't we summarize this now? We've talked about how we got the news, how we processed the news, perhaps what our biases were before hearing about it. Well, what's your conclusion about this issue? Who's at fault, if anyone, for having people in Texas suffer so much for power outage? And what can we agree should be done to prevent this in the future? Have you come to a conclusion in your own mind about this?
Oh, I'm sure that there's going to be a strong push toward plugging that whole structure into the net. And then they'll try to finesse it and say, well, if it's up to this point, we'll get that power from you, but then we'll sell it to somebody else. I mean, they'll mess around with it some so that they can guarantee that they have some all the time. Right. But it'll be more expensive, as they will tell you, no doubt.
Now, what is the Texas Power Corporation's downside for joining a national grid? In their mind, that's what I figured out, because I'm like, you can still make money.
You can't make as much.
Can't make as much.
But why? Because if you're not selling power in this crisis, you're losing money.
Yeah.
there's a variable rate on the power. That's why some of the people got such outlandishly large bills, $50,000 bill for a couple of days power, is because it's strictly supply and demand. So if they're not producing the power, what they do produce is extremely expensive. And for them, their advantage is they can raise it a little bit and make a shitload of money. I mean, you follow the money is really the answer to your question. It's their advantage is it's more profitable for them.
Yeah.
Gotcha. One of my things now, I'm debating whether it's joining the grid, and there's that, but there's also, which is more important, the joining the grid discussion and action on that, or the Green New Deal discussion of you should include extreme weather precautions in regulations.
Yeah.
Which is a stronger push.
Well, I think there's an underlying thing, and my take on it would be all power should be government owned. This should not be a private enterprise. We went through this in Louisville. The Louisville Gas and Electric Company used to be a quasi-governmental agency where the city of Louisville had a lot of control over what LG&E did. But we lost that control, and now, last time I heard, it's owned by the whole enterprise is owned by a German corporation. So, we don't have any control over our power at all. And I think one of the things that may be starting to spin around in the heads of some conservatives is this idea of privatization is going to come back and bite you in the ass one way or another. Privatization and offshore allocation of the semiconductors recently. I guess you followed that story.
Yeah.
Like, if we want to produce semiconductors, it's not, I heard somebody say, it's not a matter of money, it's a matter of time. It's going to take us 10 years to start producing semiconductors because we've lost all the technology and the expertise. So,
I'm sure our relationship with China in 10 years is going to be great.
Well, the underlying principle is, do you make decisions about whatever it is that serves the public interest? Do you make those decisions based on the profit motive for the corporations who own it? Or do you take a more socialist approach and say the reason we're giving you this ability, the reason we allow you to run your lines through our county is because that serves us, not because it serves you. And I don't know if that kind of radical thinking will ever, it seems radical now. It used to be the common sense. Of course, we don't want the Germans to own our power. I mean, imagine 1941 if we said the Germans own our power company. Well, there's huge uproar. Well, the Chinese, the Saudis, perhaps the German, more for the Germans, they own a lot of our infrastructure. They own a lot of our capability. And the decisions about what they do are really it's not up to Congress or state legislators, it's up to the board of that company.
And I would add to that, it wasn't the Germans being sneaky and figuring out a way to own everything. It was just the market. And they're like, I'm going to find a seller. The Germans got money. So it was our choices.
Well, but it's also the lie about the market. What is the market? It's not a free market. It's a group of people who are trying to squeeze out a little more profit with less investment. We don't want to have to, in my neighborhood in particular, every time there's a storm, there's a damn line that goes down. Right. Well, if you're building new housing, you don't put wires up. You run all that stuff underground. Well, when are we ever going to get our wires put underground? Well, the only time it's going to come is if we take control of the power company and we force the issue, because the power company is not going to do it, even though over the long run, it may be more efficient, more effective for them. They're not concerned about the long run.
Right.
I heard someone the other day talking about, I don't want to ramble here, but there's a train here that seems to be consistent. I guess it was Bill Maher was talking about this or something, but they said, Republicans don't worry about the future. It means nothing to them. They worry about this quarter, what's happening right now. And they're, the future is, Bill Barr said, well, I'll grow old and die. I'm not going to worry about it. I'll be gone. Well, that's a hell of an attitude, So there's an underlying thing here. Like, do you take the short-term benefit and sacrifice the long-term good, or do you, tighten your belt and be more frugal in what you do and more, future oriented? So I'm going to stop there because I get on.
Well, you laid it out again. Here on the right, you got the people think that money ought to run everything, and on the left, you got some people, at least, that think at least the people that live here should make a difference, otherwise known as Republicans and Democrats. So yeah, that's exactly the same thing over again, and we, as soon as you start talking like that, they start up the socialist, screaming socialist machine. And yeah, I mean, how do you get by that? So that doesn't work, guys. Let's talk about something further. I mean,
Now I usually go in of the left-right compromise in my own head is, how do we guarantee basic needs and then allow market profit? So do one and then the other. So this is the idea of, like, of course, I'm not a civic planner or a power company person, so I have no idea, but it's like, okay, well, let's guarantee we have a solar panel program like we do here in Chicago, where they basically pay you to put solar power on. They'll never pay a bill in your life. It's fantastic. Let's have a, where they refurbish your home so it takes less energy. And then there's the personal consumer of, like, just buy less. So let's make sure there's a minimum we have to do. It's like, we have 6 million people living here. How much, what's the minimum wage of energy they need? And let's guarantee that. So if you want to operate a company and make money off of energy, you have to pay into that fund that helps the solar panels. But then, so that's marketing to individuals. And then, but businesses, like, that's where the companies can make money, where, like, okay, you helped us guaranteed every home never goes without power. Now you can get energy off the grid from those solar panels, maybe give the people a little money too. You can have your power plants to charge your factories and things like that. Like, is there a way to provide the basic needs and profit?
The purpose, I think, you have to understand the goal. It's like, if you've put the fox in charge of the hen house, don't expect.
I'm talking about regulations.
Well, but the Republicans have convinced many Americans that regulations are bad, and the carrot they're using is, without regulations, you can have things for less money. And that sounds real good to people. Less money, I don't have to pay as much. Oh, that's great. What they don't say is, you'll pay less money now, but down the road, you're going to pay a shitload more. Right. It's so there's an essential divergence here. And I think, Paul, you were alluding to that, is they think money and controlling the money and making big money is the only thing that's important. And I don't know if we all realize, those of us on the left side of this ledger, I don't know if we realize how cynical they are. There are people, I heard one politician talking about the COVID vaccine, and they were, the question was, well, why are communities of color and poorer people not getting the testing and the treatment and so forth the way other neighborhoods are? And he basically said, fuck them, that we'll survive and the weak will die, and that's the way it is. And he pretty much put it in those terms. And I don't know if everybody realizes, these political struggles we have, it's not like, a football game where somebody wins and somebody loses and we come back to play again. The stakes are, we live and you die. It's that serious. So when the hurricane hit New Orleans, they didn't give a shit. A bunch of poor black people down there, they don't give a damn about them. You're doing a great job, Brownie. Yeah, fuck them. Yeah. When the hurricane hit Houston, they had to care more. You know, it's, by God, these are white people here. We got to take care of them. So there is underneath all this cynicism. There's the great picture from Texas was the Houston skyline all lit up in the background, and all the houses in the front are all dead dark. And it was a perfect little, you know, icon for what was going on. It's screw the poor people. And for me, I hate to keep going back to this, but Paul, you mentioned a long time ago, we've talked about this many times, about the fall of the Soviet Union and how that changed the consciousness of everyone, because there wasn't this boogeyman who was a threat to capitalism around. Well, we're seeing the manifestation of that now. The capitalists don't have to care about communism anymore. So they don't need you.
No.
And you're no threat to them anymore. So they can say, fuck you. You know, who cares if you die? And there's nobody that you can appeal to and say, well, wait a minute. You know, if a guy like Bernie Sanders becomes such an existential threat that you can hardly even stand to mention his name, wow, you know, we've gone completely to the right in our thinking. The whole idea of a true revolution where we take over the capitalists and put an end to their oligarchy, you know, that's not even on the menu.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Dustin, I don't want to direct that specifically at you, but when you were talking about how can we do this to make things work for everybody, they don't care if it works for everybody. They really don't care if it works for everybody. They care for them.
I was thinking it is more of like the idea of believing in Congress that's this thing that you can pressure. Of course, I skipped over that first step, which is a doozy. Most people don't believe in Congress, so they don't think it's worthwhile to pressure their politicians. If that were true, like if they felt it was a good thing to do, then the pressure, I think, not abandoning either side.
Mm-hmm.
But in my mind, seems like something someone on the right could compromise on, of establish basic needs, then free market. And it seems like because they're, especially in Texas, they're enduring pain right now. They're like, yeah, I want a free market and independence, whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't agree with it, but they also know that nobody helped them.
Right. Well, historically, you know, it took the Great Depression to put an end to the, you know, the capitalist stranglehold on the country prior to 1930. You know, as the barons of industry who had monopolized capital were still doing that. It took the system actually failing and everybody being thrown, or most people anyway, being thrown into disarray before we could have a socialist push under Roosevelt. So, you know, somehow, and this, I guess I've heard this frustration among liberals in the last several years. How can these Trump supporters support him? You know, don't they understand? Well, apparently they all think they're going to be Trump someday. In their own mind, they say, well, you know, when I make millions of dollars, I don't want some immigrant taking it from me, or I don't want some welfare mother taking it from me. So they see themselves as being someone who is immune for this. And when bad shit starts to happen to them, they don't blame the person they aspire to be. They blame the other person. It's illogical, but you know. Anyway, I'm veering off target here.
Well, that was a good, because I'll push back on the why somebody's a Trump supporter. All this time, and it's so interesting because there are reasons.
Yeah. And
just because they have reasons doesn't mean they're insane. Like
because they have reasons doesn't mean they're rational.
Right. Yeah. Where it's like, you know, the first reason, you know, there is we could talk about how consumerist culture in general makes us individual and not thinking of the broader group, and how society has changed so much with industrialization and urbanization. We don't have the same kind of tribes we used to have. We don't operate, you know, in groups the same way humans have done for tens of thousands of years. So there's that, there's the consumerism, and there's the propaganda, and there's that individual focus. So that is a big deal.
Mhm.
There's also the deal of, this is the one thing that I think people on the left are finally, maybe it's starting to turn the light on, is, listen, I'm voting for Trump because you've been degrading me.
Mhm.
And it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Where if you don't go into the discussion about this, and it's really easy, it's like, just as I said, and it's like, well, they're in Texas. They're stupid in Texas. I'm like, no. Keep the focus on the greed,
Mhm.
and corporate and governmental greed.
Right.
We can all agree on that enemy. Remember who the enemy is. Because if you don't do that, then you're like, well, the people in Texas are stupid. And then if I hear, every time I turn on something other than Fox, someone is calling me stupid, eventually you're going to get pissed off at that.
Yeah.
And the fact, like, when we go back to Russiagate, for 4 years, I heard, now I'm outside of both of these things. So there's, on the other side, I forget, socialism, boogeyman, whatever. I look over there, I'm like, that's insane. And of course they feel they're righteous. And any liberal watching Fox News is going to get triggered as hell. I'll go to MSNBC, looking at Russiagate. I'm like, well, of course that's outrageous. Any conservative watching this is going to get triggered as hell. So boil all this down to the schoolyard fight, and then you'll see how unproductive it is.
Yeah.
So it's this constant thing of, why did somebody support Trump? And I'm like, well, there's the partisanship that is, we can get into that and why partisanship is bad and how we've all been sucked into it. We can get into that of, just because they're on the other side of the television screen doesn't make them less human. Maybe we should talk about community. And we get into, there are, it's the generalization.
Mhm.
There's lots of reasons to people to think somebody, like, I have to do this too. It's like, well, you're a Biden supporter? Oh my God, you're an idiot. Like, how come you don't know all this stuff? Like this whole, well, anybody who's a Biden supporter just doesn't know anything.
Yeah.
They don't know about all the bombs. And I'm like, no, it's less than that.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We need to kind of get ready to wrap up, but I think this has been a lot of interest to me, because what I'd like to do from this point forward is have both of you start looking for specific examples. If you hear something in the news that you think, where you think the narrative is being skewed and controlled very deliberately, I'd like for you to bring it up here so we can kind of check notes. What I'm really interested in is trying to find a third route here, a third rail to run on. I don't trust liberal media, and I certainly don't trust conservative media. I am looking for someone who can give me information in such a way that I can formulate an informed opinion and try to understand my biases, and, as I said, formulated an opinion so that I can express that to others and not just feed back the bullet points. If I watch MSNBC and I listen to all their crap and they tell me something, and then I go into a discussion with somebody who watches only Fox, we just throw bullet points at each other.
Mm-hmm.
We don't, or I guess fire bullet points would be more appropriate.
It's called fire hosing, yeah.
So at any rate, if there's something coming up, I'd like for you to look this week and see, is there a story? And if you see one, contact everybody in the interim to say, pay attention to this and find out, look at your sources and see how they're handling this information and what kind of things they're doing to manipulate you. I go back to the fact that this is all about money. Media and information is a commodity.